Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about addressing problematic religious views, church hurt, and spiritual abuse. We'll be talking about differentiating between spiritual integration, spiritual counseling, and spiritual guidance, learning how to assess if someone's beliefs are harmful, and maybe some brief ethical ways to address that, and a ton of resources to do that, learning about spiritual abuse and church hurt, and then, like I said, providing a ton of resources. And there are some trigger warnings for this talk. The following words: trauma, spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, and suicide will be used within this talk. This is for education only. If any of this is triggering, I will place a resource in the link on YouTube so that you can reach out to someone in your area. I am Dr. Patrice Berry, and I received my bachelor's in psychology from Virginia Tech. And really, it was there that I wanted to go further and learn about spiritual integration. All of my professors, and this was a long, long time ago, but when I was there, the professors that did maybe have religious beliefs did not talk about the intersection of faith and psychology. And then the professors that did not believe in anything spiritual were very vocal about that, about their beliefs about faith only being a coping skill. Or I heard a lot of really negative comments that did not resonate with my spiritual experience. I went on to complete my master's and doctorate in clinical psychology from Regent University. That is a Christian college, and we were able to learn how to ethically integrate faith into treatment. The thing that I really liked about my education there was that we were trained to respect everyone. Sometimes I've had to point out that the chancellor of that university was not my professor, and that my professors were amazing and provided a really great experience where I realized that I am a psychologist that happens to be a Christian. I am not a Christian psychologist, and I operate within a secular practice. I am a licensed psychologist in the state of Virginia, and I practice therapy. I used to do psychological testing. With the pandemic, we'll see. And then I also do some coaching. I'm a trainer and a speaker. I have over 15 years of clinical experience, and I've provided trainings, including some CEU trainings for a few different organizations. Let's hop right into spiritual integration versus spiritual counseling. Spiritual integration occurs when the practitioner integrates part of the client's faith into treatment. And that might happen where somebody is doing cognitive behavior therapy, and they might include some spiritual components if that aligns with the client's faith and if that is something that the client wants to do. Spiritual counseling, for example, Christian counseling, is where you take that spiritual approach and then put that throughout the entire treatment. And that can occur within a religious or non religious setting. I have had people request Christian counseling from me, and I often ask them questions about what does that mean to them? Because if what they're actually asking for is spiritual guidance, where they can talk with somebody and ask questions about their faith, and it's not really about mental health, I typically refer them back to their church. In general, spiritual counseling is typically provided by a practitioner that has the same faith as the client. Whereas spiritual integration, I can integrate faith for a client and we may not share the same spiritual background. And anyone doing spiritual counseling still abides by the same ethical guidelines. If they're a licensed counselor, that's within their license, or if it is what sometimes they call lay counseling, where it is somebody that is not a licensed professional, they have certain ethical standards and boundaries that they are supposed to stay within as well. One of the biggest ones for the lay counselors, somebody that does not have a license to practice counseling, that is where they would refer if somebody came with a clinical issue. If somebody was having thoughts of harm, of self or others, if there was an issue that was of a clinical nature that needed to be managed by a licensed professional. So, why is this important? So, a lot of Americans have a belief in God and identify religion or spiritual beliefs that are important to them and may practice a religion. And they may use certain religious coping, praying, attending service, meditation. And I really like this quote. that helping, fixing, and serving represent three different ways of seeing life. When you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. When you serve, you see life as whole. Fixing and helping may be the work of the ego, and service, the work of the soul. I really like that because I think that goes into what counselors should strive to do. We should strive to serve our clients. Mental health can have an impact on faith or spiritual functioning. It can impact feelings of guilt or shame, where a person may feel that because they had a certain behavior or because they feel a certain way or because of how they are, that might trigger certain feelings of guilt and shame. Often people may feel that coming to therapy is somehow them not having enough faith. And that is one thing that I say. I'm active on social media, and that is one thing that I say all the time because it takes faith to go to therapy because you're having hope that things can get better. And that is where I really work towards helping people not have that shame. And then I may check in with them about how help seeking is viewed within their religious community. Mental health can impact somebody's ability to attend religious services. So if somebody has significant depression, they may not feel like going to service. They may have significant social anxiety and struggle to attend service regularly. Mental health can impact somebody's prayer life, their communication with their higher being. Mental health and past events can affect someone's experience of feeling heard or loved by God, which closely relates to somebody maybe feeling distant from God. And then I also like to talk about within their faith tradition, what do they think about being angry towards God? And as someone that is working within a clinical setting, I do not bring what I believe into the session. And if a client says something that doesn't seem to quite fit with what I believe others may feel within that same religion, I will often try to get a release to be able to talk with somebody from their church or have them go back to their faith community to check and see, was this their perception or is this what everybody really believes? So faith can have an impact on physical functioning. There's been a lot of research on cancer treatments and religious beliefs where they found that spirituality and religion can be important to the well-being of people who have cancer, enabling them to better cope with the disease. Spirituality and religion may help patients and families find deeper meaning and experience a sense of personal growth during cancer treatment while living with cancer and as a cancer survivor. And this isn't saying that everyone has to have these beliefs. The research found a correlation between faith and decreased negative emotions, decreased feelings of loneliness, lower levels of substance abuse, lowered blood pressure, and less physical symptoms. Faith and spiritual beliefs can impact somebody's thoughts about grief, their thoughts about suicide or divorce, parenting, forgiveness, hope, joy, and love. There are several ways in which abuse can be spiritual, and these are copied from nacr.org. There is a sense in which all abuse can be spiritual. Some abuse is spiritual abuse because it takes place in a spiritual place or context. The use of spiritual truths or biblical texts to do harm is another form of spiritual abuse. And I have seen this with corporal punishment, where people use certain biblical texts to justify physical abuse, which can often then impact the person's connection with their faith. Some abuse is spiritual because the victim perceives the abuser to be in a position of spiritual authority. Coercive spirituality, where people feel like they really don't have a choice within their faith, that can be a form of spiritual abuse. Some abuse is spiritual because it invokes divine authority in order to manipulate people into performing behaviors which meet the needs of the abuser. And this can often be financial. It may relate to the time that people are expected to give. It can relate to a whole bunch of things. And there's a difference between somebody giving or doing these things out of their own will or their own heart or desire. It's something else when people are feeling like they are having their arm twisted to give or to do things, that is where that power differential can sometimes be used and it can cause some problems. And then some abuse is spiritual because it introduces a graceless contingency in our relationship with God. Here is another definition that I found where spiritual abuse is a form of emotional and psychological abuse. It is characterized by a systematic pattern of coercive and controlling behavior in a religious context. This may include manipulation, exploitation, enforced accountability, censorship of decision making, where the church has to approve decisions before somebody can move forward with something, requirements for secrecy and silence, coercion to conform, inability to ask questions, control through the use of sacred texts or teachings, requirement of obedience to the abuser, the suggestion that the abuser has a divine position, isolation as a means of punishment, and superiority and elitism. This was a slide that I found by Robert Munson, where it says, most, if not all, spiritual abusers do not see themselves as abusers, where if you approach them about their behavior, they would often feel that they were doing divine work. They often would not view what they are doing as being abusive. And then also, most who are spiritually abused do not see themselves as being abused at first. It can be a really confusing place for somebody to be in. And that's where having therapists, having people, having community members that are aware of this, that can be really helpful to maybe point out to somebody like, that's not typical. That doesn't seem to sit right with me. And that may help somebody get out of an unsafe situation. I wanted to define some terms. Cults are groups that often exploit members psychologically and or financially, typically making members comply with leadership's demands through certain types of psychological manipulation, popularly called mind control, and through the inclusion of deep-seated anxious dependency on the group and its leaders. Religion is defined as a system of beliefs in a divine or superhuman power and practices of worship or other rituals directed towards such power. Spirituality, which is a lot more broad, is a subjective experience of the sacred. Spiritual abuse is the mistreatment of a person who is in need of help, support, or other greater spiritual empowerment, with the result of weakening, undermining, or decreasing the person's spiritual empowerment. So I wanted to get into some myths within purity culture, specifically within Christianity. The spiritual barometer myth says that what matters most about a person is his or her virginity. In other words, purity culture implies, and sometimes even directly claims, that a believer's sexual history is the primary mark of their spiritual status. Purity is used to measure faith, to judge how good of a Christian someone is compared to others. Rather than knowing Christians by their relationship with Jesus, purity culture asserts that we will know them by their virginity. And with a lot of these often affect women. Using purity as a measure of spiritual health breeds pride and judgment among believers. It effectively makes an idol out of not having sex and exchanges the wonderful message of grace for a works based religion in which salvation is dependent only on following rules. Fairy tale myth is where if somebody just waits and avoids casual dating, that then their Prince Charming will come and they will have this amazing marriage. The fairy tale myth reduces God to a fairy godmother who grants our wishes as long as we do the right thing. It twists our relationship with God into a transaction. Staying pure equals a dream spouse. There really aren't any guarantees within scripture. We aren't guaranteed a fairy tale marriage or even a spouse, and it can be misleading to tell single Christians otherwise. The flip switch myth. And so that is where sometimes people are told that if they remain pure until marriage, that on their wedding night, this flip is going to switch and then they're going to be guaranteed amazing sex life. And that can leave many Christian couples feeling disappointed, disillusioned, and not really receiving proper preparation, education, and communication about having a fulfilling sex life. Purity culture promises single adults that they will automatically have amazing sex if they wait until marriage, but there is no power to deliver on that myth. And sometimes I've also seen that sometimes this flip switch myth, there are some women that end up developing certain sexual dysfunctions, having issues with arousal or having issues with other things once they do get into marriage, or they aren't taught about what makes a fulfilling sex life. The damaged goods myth. If we buy into the idea that virginity determines salvation or some type of spiritual maturity, that we're owed a fairy tale marriage and then we'll have amazing sex if we've waited, the myth four says that we're spoiled or damaged goods if you have premarital sex, especially for women. Purity culture uses all sorts of analogies and metaphors and stories to illustrate this toxic myth. The primary message of purity culture is clear. You won't be whole, clean, and pure if you have premarital sex. Not being a virgin doesn't mean you're less than, broken, or undeserving of love. It doesn't make you unworthy of a loving, godly spouse, a strong, blessed marriage, or a healthy sex life. Myth five, women as the gatekeepers myth. Purity culture was born out of patriarchy. The messages of purity culture are rooted in patriarchal theology and traditional gender roles. And this really goes into the fact of often the pressure is put on the woman to dress modestly and to do this and this and this in order to not tempt men, which kind of makes it seem as though women don't have sexual desires themselves and there aren't things that men could do that could also help if a couple is making a decision to wait until a certain point to have physical intimacy. And this leads right into the seven lies that purity culture teaches women. And the biggest one is that it teaches them that women are responsible for men's sexual sins, that women's bodies are something to be ashamed of, that women don't have sexual desire, that your virginity is the only thing of worth about you, that women don't enjoy sex as much as men, that if women have sex before marriage, everything will go wrong, and that there is no difference between sexual abuse and sex before marriage. And these are all lies. And the article below goes into each one of those a little bit more. I want to talk a little bit about cultivating healthy sexuality within church. And so instead of health, sexuality has been attached to shame, guilt, fear, and abuse way too often in the church. The increase of sexual harassment and abuse allegations surfacing, in part thanks to the hashtag Church2 movement, is proof that until today, churches have neglected to address their failures in the area of sexuality. There's an article that goes into that a little bit more. Some of my tips about fostering healthy sexuality within the church would be to remove shame and guilt, to make sure to teach accurate information, to remove language that targets women, and to teach about consent, including consent within marriage. Religion in the LGBTQ community. Religion has been a source of both solace for some and suffering for many lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer Americans. For example, most LGBTQ Americans have been raised in an organized religion, and many continue to cherish their faith community. Too many have been forced to leave those communities behind because of condemnation. In recent years within the US, there have been many religious groups that have officially welcomed LGBTQ people as members. There's a link below that has information about different religious organizations and the statements that they've issued regarding the LGBTQ community, and also the ordination of LGBTQ clergy, and also people that will do same sex marriage. Anytime that I'm working with somebody and they are looking for a religious community, sometimes they're able to find a religious community that is tolerant. Sometimes it might be accepting. It might be supportive. They might be able to find one with that has some admiration. And the riddle scale really goes into levels of support. And from one being repulsion and homophobia, all the way to nurturance and really wanting people to find affirming spaces if they can. And then some people, because they've been in a community for so long, if that community can at least be supportive of them and of their family and of their partner, for some people, that is enough. I recently attended a training with Joe Court, and he's the author of LGBTQ Clients in Therapy. And he asked a question, and we talked a little bit about is heteronormative expectations a form of abuse? And that is where somebody may say to somebody that's a part of the LGBTQ community something extremely distasteful, like, oh, if you've never been with, then how do you know? As if that experience would somehow reorient them. And there's no evidence that that would even be true. And often that can be very damaging and very harmful to people. And it can open them up to place themselves in situations that may not be safe or that may not be comfortable for them, or to try to conform to heteronormative expectations. And he really did call it possibly a form of abuse. And he notes that abuse doesn't always cause trauma. And so trauma would be that reaction where I'm unable to cope with what happened. And he also made the distinction that abuse will not orient you, it can disorient you. He works a lot with individuals that have histories of trauma and that are also a part of the LGBTQ community. And sometimes that can be confusing for an individual if their first experience wasn't their choice. And he notes that it will not orient a person. And so, somebody that was already going to orient in another direction, that it will not orient them, but it can disorient them. There can be some really harmful messages within Pray the Gay Away programs, especially when somebody attends something like that that's supposed to free them or they think is going to heal or cure it. And if they still have those thoughts and feelings, that can increase feelings of suicidal ideation and depression and anxiety. Conversion therapy has been proven to be extremely harmful. And that's one of the things. So I'm glad that within my training at Regent that we learned that conversion therapy was extremely harmful. And many states are making it illegal to do that type of therapy with minors because it's often their parents that are trying to get them into that type of therapy and not necessarily the child. And then the Reformation Project has some really good information on there as well. Some additional resources for clinicians. So, when I'm working with somebody, I encourage them to find a safe community. Attempt to see if a client's beliefs appear to be problematic and consistent with their community. One time, somebody said they had a certain belief that didn't seem to fit within what their family believed, and it was a different religion from mine. And when I checked in with the family, they were able to confirm, no, we do not believe this. And they were able to talk with the person because really it was their own negative automatic thought. And it wasn't coming from their religious tradition. And it was really coming more from what they had been through. And so sometimes being able to clarify those things can be really helpful if you notice that somebody has maybe some problematic beliefs. I also remember working with someone that thought that their faith was wanting them to harm themselves, and that wasn't consistent with their religious tradition at all. And we were able to talk about religious texts that went against that specific belief. Therapists can provide resources to a client that they can then research on their own and discuss ways in which parents, individuals can provide discipline without re traumatizing. For example, physical abuse with an adopted child who was physically abused, or really, in my experience, with an adopted child at all. And here's some more of my opinions. So, and clinicians have to know how they feel about these things. So, I personally do not pray with clients. If a client asks for me to pray for them, I ask them if they would like me to pray with them and them to pray for themselves, and I will listen. And I think therapists should just be honest and should talk about how the client feels about that. And so a therapist should have an idea of what they would say if a client asks about religious topics. If a client asks, I will often tell them that I am a Christian and then talk about what that means to them. One of my favorite stories was when somebody was in my office and I'd worked with them for a long time and they said, I don't like Christians. And I was like, it's like, I'm a Christian. And they're like, oh, like I thought Christians were judgmental. And we were able to use it as a learning experience, as a learning moment. Therapists should have an idea of how they feel about hugs and affection in session. For me personally, I typically do not give hugs to clients. If somebody asks So we set up certain boundaries where they're able to ask, and then I'm able to say yes or no. And then I only do a side hug. And it's often out in the lobby. And if a client is crying, and if it's a child, I will often bring a parent in to comfort them. I have very clear boundaries around how I comfort someone. And people have to just determine with their supervisor for themselves what are they most comfortable with, and then also what's most comfortable for their client as well. Are there any adjustments that need to be made in treatment based on cultural or religious beliefs? And then I do think that a clinician should refer someone out if they have negative beliefs about the religion, about the culture or group. And then when I'm working with somebody that struggles with guilt and shame, I typically use resources from Brene Brown just to help talk about and address that. That guilt is about what I did, and shame is about who I am. And often, many of the people that I work with are struggling with shame. Here are some resources. Here are some resources from spiritualabuseresources.com. Here are some more of those related to vulnerability and psychological perspectives on abusive groups and cults. And then the Reformation Project had some additional resources. And then my references, and some were tagged earlier in the presentation. And then if this content is interesting to you, you can follow me over on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, or Clubhouse at Dr. Patrice Berry. I also have a podcast, Legacy Moments, and a YouTube channel. I hope this was helpful. I hope you have a good day.